All right. So who has control of the slides?
Over
Do
here.
you have control of them? So
One does.
Agile Retrospectives, making good teams great. I'm Esther Derby, and I've been doing retrospectives for a long time. I've been doing retrospectives since we used to call them project retrospectives, and we would do them at the end of a year-long marathon project. But it's not necessarily the best time to incorporate learning. So since we have been working in smaller increments, I've been doing a lot of work with Agile retrospectives. So Diana and I got together and wrote this book to share some of what we've learned about doing retrospectives that are small and compact and are looking at a short period of work. So I will introduce Diana now. This is Diana Larson. She brings a great wealth of experience working with teams, working with self-organizing teams. I first met Diana through a friend who thought we would have some fun working together, and he turned out to be right. So we've been having fun working together ever since. Did you want to?
Yes, and I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, Esther Derby. We have been working on this. We worked on this book for a couple of years, and during that time, we pair wrote. We only wrote when we were in the same room, and we had one keyboard. So we tried to incorporate what we could of Agile practices and philosophies into actually our producing of this book. And so it was that was a really valuable experience for us. And every single time we got together, we got together for week-long increments. At the end of every iteration, we had a retrospective on what we had done during that time. So I have, as Esther said, where a colleague introduced us, and his idea was that we would work well together because he thought we had very complementary skills. And Esther brings to our collaboration a much longer background in working in software development. There was a time when she coded in an assembler.
Yeah, my favorite.
It was some time ago. However, she also has had the experience of moving so that one day she was a coder and the next day she was managing coders, and which is also an interesting experience. And from that, started working a lot with people who were managing software projects, and is also the co-author of a book called Behind Closed Doors with Johanna Rothman. So, wealth of experience, and really delighted to have her as my collaborator.
So I should tell you that where I come from, if we say something's interesting, it's not necessarily good. It's like, oh, what an interesting baby. Yeah. All right. So enough about us. What about you guys? How many of you have led retrospectives? Few. How many of you have been in a retrospective?
More.
Yeah. So what was it like to be in the retrospective? Okay, so 5 is wonderful and 1 is not so great. Okay, got kind of a range. We've got some 4s, we've got some 3s. Well, hopefully we can give you some.
I think there's one other piece of data that out of that. How many in here have never led or been in a retrospective and are just here because you're curious?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think retrospectives are a critical thing a critical practice to bring to Agile projects because they are so tied to the principle of inspect and adapt. We inspect and adapt our code when we do demonstrations, when we review our code, when we test our code. We have lots of ways to get feedback about how our code is doing and inspect and adapt that, and how our products are doing. And retrospectives are the way that we inspect and adapt our methods, our engineering practices, and our teamwork. So it fits right in with that feedback cycle of looking at what you're doing, checking to see if it's working well for you, if it's doing what you need it to do, or whether you need to make some changes, try some experiments, try doing things a different way. So this is an inspect and adapt cycle that happens for your methods and your teamwork at the end of every iteration. Now, when we were doing long retrospectives on long projects, we might spend, I think the longest one I did was 4 days. Does that sound kind of scary? Yes. Yeah. Well, it was a 4-year project where they had worked very, very hard to create the product that was going to save the company. And after 4 years, they put it into their test. It was an embedded system kind of thing. They put it into their test factory and not a belt moved or a door opened or a valve changed. So it was a big deal for that company. I tend to think if they had been doing retrospectives earlier, they wouldn't have found themselves in that fix. But we're really going to focus on the retrospectives that you use to look at your work after an iteration. So how long are your iterations here? Are you doing 1 week, 2 week iterations? 1 or 2 week iterations? Okay, maybe up to 30 days. What's the longest iteration you have here? 4 weeks?
4 weeks, yeah. So mostly two weeks,
Yeah.
some 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to cover a flexible framework that you can use for a very, very short retrospective, the kind of hour and a half you may spend at the end of iteration just working with your team at the end of a week-long iteration. But you could also expand it to use it on a much longer chunk of work.
So this is, there are lots of books sitting around on the seats of chairs, and you'll find this particular graphic in those books. It illustrates that the idea that this is an ongoing and linked process that just flows naturally at the end of each iteration, moves right into the retrospective. And the framework that we are proposing and that we have found works very, very well for us, and we're getting a lot of feedback that says it works well for other folks, is during that retrospective, we go through 5 sort of chunks of work that the group needs to do in order to have a successful retrospective. And the first one is to set the stage. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. That's kind of getting everybody's head in the room and doing the things that help get the thing going. And then gathering some data. Very often we start making decisions about what we want to change or not change about how we're doing things without really looking at the data first. So the data gathering phase is a really important one. Once we have some data to look at, data about facts things that happened during the iteration and how we responded to those things that happened, then we have the opportunity to make meaning of it, generate some insights, figure out, well, what does that mean for us that these things happened and that we had these responses or reactions? This happened as a result of that. What does that mean for us? And so we generate some insights. Then once we've done that, then we're really prepared to say, well, so what do we want to do the same or differently, or what new things do we want to try in our next iteration? So then we get to decide what to do. And deciding, oftentimes people jump to that before they've really gathered any data or made meaning of it. And so it's an important part of the retrospective, but it needs to come after those other phases. And then once we have decided, well, so here's the experiment we're going to try in our next iteration, then it's time to say, okay, we're going to close off this retrospective. It's the end of this one. It happens in a clean kind of way. We recap what we've decided. We do a retrospective on the retrospective, figure out how we might improve that the next time around, and then we're done. And then we move right into the planning part of the next iteration. So it's a smooth continuum of flow of work. Right out of the iteration demo, into the retrospective, planning, back into the iteration work. So it just goes on and on.
So speaking of on and on, sometimes people look at that and they think, oh my God, this is going to take forever, or we don't have time to spend that much time. But actually, we find that you can do these 5 stages or these 5 pieces quickly. I mean, you can do this in an hour easily. Sometimes I've done it in 15 minutes, depending on what the situation was. But we find that it's really important to go through all of those 5 stages. And if you skip one, you tend to have either people are not in the room with you, or they're talking from different, everybody's looking at a different set of data. Everybody's not on the same page, to use that phrase. Or people may not have decisions that everyone can support and move forward with. So it sounds like a lot to do, but it can be done quickly. And we find that if you skip one of these, you compromise the results. So we're going to talk a little bit about each one of these stages. So set the stage is actually where you just kind of set the container for the work you're going to be doing. So you have a goal. How many of you are using a goal like continuous improvement, or decide, what went well, what went differently? Yes, some of you. How many of you are using a goal that's different than that, of those who are doing retrospectives? Yeah, okay. That's a reasonable goal to start out with. Let's look at what's working and what's not working. We find that after a while, that gets really boring, and people can't think of anything else they want to change. So then it's useful to switch the goal to maybe looking at our teamwork, looking at how well we're applying our coding standards, looking at how well we're refactoring, looking at how well we're doing the XP practices. So that's all part of the stage, is deciding what the goal is for this particular retrospective. So you have a goal, you have a plan laid out, you tell people what the plan is, because people like to know how they're going to be spending their time. And often we do some kind of check-in, just so people can say a little bit about what's going on for them and set it aside. I find check-ins are really helpful for people to unhook from the stuff that's been going on for the rest of their day and just get into the room. Sometimes we do working agreements at this point. And this is one of the exercises we often do as a precursor to working agreements, which is helping people focus on what the ways they're going to interact together that will help them achieve a really good result out of the retrospective. Has anyone ever been in a retrospective that kind of turned into a downward cycle of blame and finding? Yeah, it can happen if you don't pay attention to this stuff. So that's another reason to spend some time setting the stage. This is an exercise we do called Focus On, Focus Off, that I've kind of abbreviated to FOFO now. Which asks people to look at, what would it look like if we had an inquiring state of mind versus we were being in advocacy? What would it look like if we were trying to be in dialogue with the people on our team rather than debating the people on our team? And use that as a precursor to help people make some agreements for the time of the retrospective. They're not forever, they're not for the rest of your life, but just about how we're going to work together during this retrospective. We're tag teaming it here.
So we have our goal. We have some agreements about how we're going to work together. We've kind of got everybody's head space is in the room now. Now we're ready to think together, and that really is what begins to happen. What's happening in data gathering, and one of the things that we've noticed a lot in working with Agile methods is it's a very team-focused kind of way of going about developing software. Well, most of us are trained very well to think and make decisions and gather data and analyze and all those kinds of things as an individual. I mean, that's mostly what our academics prepare us for. Sharing ideas with someone sometimes is called cheating in the way we are prepared. But then we get into the workplace, and particularly in an Agile environment, and we're expected to be a group. And so this is where we start using different kinds of methods and tools to think together as a group, which is a different way of thinking for most of us. And it's one of the reasons I think that teams often struggle with doing processes like retrospectives and planning, is because they're not used to thinking together. And so gathering data is one of the first things we do in this process of really beginning to think together. So as we gather data, we look back over the course of the iteration or the release or whatever period of time we're looking at in the retrospective. We go back. We use various methods for this. Sometimes we use a method called, a timeline, where we ask people to actually put events. This was a group of folks who were doing a retrospective over a bigger piece of planning and 3 iterations. So they thought back through what had happened as they did that process and put up the events that they felt were important to them so that we had some data. We had a common understanding of what this project had been so far, what the experience, what the work had been so far. Very often, we are all working heads down. We come to the end of the iteration, and we have very different pictures of what went on. And so part of the job of the gather data phase is to make sure we're all talking about the same stuff, the same iteration. We all have a fuller picture of what it actually was. And so we gather data in facts, like the kinds of events that might have occurred when people came onto the project, if they came in later, what different things that might have happened. And then this one was added something called an emotional seismograph, which is folks went through and said, here's where it's what my energy was like over the course of these iterations. So we look for some way of gathering some data, not only about facts, but about feelings, but about how we responded to the events that occurred.
Can I jump in for just a second? We very rarely use the F word when we do retrospectives, the feeling word. So we may say energy instead of how are you feeling? Do you think that would work well here if you went up to someone and said, how are you feeling? Maybe not.
So sometimes this will be high energy, low energy. Sometimes we'll use a range of for gathering that data about how satisfied were you with what was going on during this part of the iteration. There are lots of other ways of gathering that kind of data without using the F word.
That F word.
That F word, yeah.
Any F word.
We want to keep in general, So that's what we're looking for in the gather data phase, to get a shared picture of what really happened during this iteration or this chunk of time. We have an agreed upon idea now of what we're really going to talk about as we go into the next couple of phases.
We found that 2 people can look at the same event and see it very, very differently. So that's why that is so important. After you've gathered some data, then it's really the time to step back and do some analysis. So this is the part where you're trying to figure out how did things get to be the way they are? What were the underlying causes? What were the patterns? What does this data tell us about how we're using our methods, how we're working together? I think in general in US culture and in engineering cultures, we really like this part. We really like getting in there and kind of figuring stuff out. And if we've gathered our data, then the team is more likely to come to some common and shared understandings rather than advocating for their own particular interpretation of why things are the way they are. So this is the part where you really dig in and you start looking into what were the patterns, what may have been the underlying causes, what are the things that are keeping the practices in place if we've tried to change things and they don't change. So there's a lot of analysis that goes on in this part of the retrospective to help you figure out really why things are the way they are and what would be a good thing for us to do to change things. So this is a simple method that we use sometimes in this part of the retrospective. This one, we call this the learning matrix, and we just divide a sheet of paper in 4 things. And at the top are what went well and what didn't go so well, what we would want to do differently, which are questions that show up in a lot of retrospectives. Sometimes they're the only questions in a retrospective, and we find that when retrospectives start there, they tend to get fairly superficial insights. But if you've gone through the gathering some data, you tend to get a better level of insight here. On the bottom part of it are, ideas of things we could do differently, and that's a little bouquet there. If there's someone you want to hand a bouquet because they did something that really helped the team. So this is a quick way to do the generating insights phase of a retrospective.
So when we have a shared picture of what went on during our work together, when we've made some meaning out of that, we're ready then to say, okay, what do we want to do with this? What direction does this send us in? What concrete actions do we want to take? And those can come in a number of different flavors. It might be things that we've been doing that we don't ever want to do again. We don't want that outcome ever to happen again. And we've done some analysis about why it happened. And so we really want to shift that. We want to do something different in that arena. It may be that we want to, or we want to adjust it in some way. We want to just refine. It may be that there's been something going on during the time that we've been working together that has actually contributed a lot to our success, but we're taking it for granted. And so we need to actually pay some attention to it and ensure that it continues. And I was actually talking with someone earlier this week about a project that they were on where they had been doing some things that were really helpful to them, and over time they kind of, they got a little smug about it, and they just stopped paying attention to some of those things, and they started noticing that their productivity was degrading. And when they really chose to have a retrospective where they focused on that solely was their goal. Why are these things not happening anymore that used to happen? That was the goal that they chose, and out of that they discovered we weren't paying attention to these things that were making us successful. So we want to look at a number of different things and then make some choices about what is it we want to do in the next iteration that we think will help to make things better around our goal, whatever our goal might be. We really suggest that teams don't take on too much. I mean, if you've got a 2-week iteration, some teams have 1-week iterations, you can't have 10 improvement plans. You'd never get any other work done, right? So you need to pick the 1 or 2 or maybe 3. And that's a big stretch. Really 1 or 2 things that as a group, the team thinks would really help them the next time, or just an experiment that they want to try. This is how some teams begin to add in some of the XP engineering practices. They'll say, well, based on some of the things that happened this last time, I think if we gave, more attention to, formally making sure that we're pairing together. And making sure that we're all doing that on a consistent basis, because now it's kind of catch as catch can, and we think we'd do better if more of us were pairing. So that might be the piece that you take on, the experiment that you try, and it's just an experiment. And at the end of the iteration, have another retrospective, you have an opportunity to assess how did that go. So then deciding what to do is where we make some choices about what are we going to do in the next iteration that we think is going to help. And, very often it's just ideas go up, and in this instance we've done some just voting with dots. And this team has made some choices about that they're going to go with whichever ideas get the highest votes, and that's how they're going to decide. It's just kind of a majority rules kind of thing, or energy rules, because I think these people all got more than 1 dot when they voted. But they made a decision. They made a decision as a group that they were all willing to support about what they're going to do in the next iteration that they think is going to continue to improve how their work gets done.
Okay. I just want to add one little subtlety about prioritizing. I have noticed that depending on how you ask the question, you get very different results. Like if you say, what's most important for us to do, you may get one set of results. People will look at the list and say, well, really, this is most important. And then sometimes it doesn't get done, right? But if you ask, what will have the biggest effect on us, or what do we have most energy for, you tend to get an agreement on something that people are going to have a little more commitment to follow through on. So,
yeah,
had to add that. Yeah. The final part of a retrospective is actually closing the retrospective. And I find that it's important and helpful to do this decisively rather than just kind of letting things dribble away and go off into another meeting. So you end it decisively by saying, we're at the end of our retrospective. I'd like to appreciate you for all your hard work. Decide how you're going to follow up. Do a retrospective on the retrospective and close. Before I go into this, I want to say something about what you do to follow up. A lot of people, I've talked to people who say that they did some retrospectives, but nothing ever changed. We came up with all these great ideas. We had this plan, and nothing ever changed. And when I ask some more questions, I usually find out that that's because either they had no way to follow up, or even more commonly, they had a separate improvement plan that lived over there somewhere. And when you have a separate improvement plan, it almost never gets incorporated into the work of developing software, because people are focusing on doing that. So that piece of follow-up about we're going to take our plans into our iteration planning meeting, I think is a critical thing for actually having retrospectives that get some results. So this is one way that we do a retrospective on a retrospective. And this is actually useful for any kind of meeting you have or working session. And it's measuring return on time invested. So you've invested an hour in this retrospective. Did you get a high return on the time you invested? Was it a break even that for an hour you feel like you got an hour's worth of insight or benefit out of it? And on zero is, this is an hour of my life I'm not going to get back, and I felt like it was wasted. So this is a way that you can look at how much value people are finding in your retrospectives and get some ideas about how to change. I would follow this up by asking what specifically would have made this a more valuable meeting for you. When I do this kind of ROTI gauge, I'm satisfied if people are at a 2 or above. 2 is break even. I invested an hour, I got an hour worth of benefit out of it. That's fine with me. If someone got a 0, then I'd want to know. And sometimes it's not about what you as a retrospective leader did. Sometimes it was that, I was so distracted by some other stuff going on that I just really couldn't participate. So it may not be a reflection on you. It may just be a reflection of what's going on. But there are a number of ways that you can look back at your retrospective and figure out how to make them better, right? In the spirit of continuous improvement. And it doesn't have to take long. That goes quite quickly.
So what we do start doing retrospectives on a regular basis. We don't just wait to the end of the project to do one big one, at which point it's too late to do anything about that project anyway. We decide we're going to commit to doing them every iteration, every release, and what will we get from that? Well, we actually went out and polled some of our colleagues who work inside big organizations and asked them, what kind of results are you getting from the retrospectives you're leading and from the retrospectives, other people in your organization are leading that you've trained in that process. And these are the things that they told us. And there are some really big companies whose names we unfortunately are not free to mention, who've actually collected some data on these dimensions. But what they tell us is they get improved productivity. People know what it is they want to do. They continue to make improvements and changes. They get into a continuous improvement state of mind, and things continually get better. Not always in a smooth curve, but over time they see that when they've installed retrospectives as a regular part of how the project gets done, they start seeing that people are just able to be more productive. They understand how they fit in the team. They understand what the work is. They understand what they're going to do. Also improves capability. And that's because in a retrospective, you begin to talk, you be in that gathering data phase where people are talking about how they have different perspectives on what happened during the iteration. People begin to be able to see things through different eyes, through not only their own experience of the iteration, but through that of other folks too. And that helps them begin to take on some additional capabilities. They can see the world in a broader kind of way. Also, as a result of some of the experiments that teams choose to do, it causes an increase in capability on the team. We've had a number of teams who've, as you may have noticed in the one illustration, teams who say, we really want to focus on sharing our learning. If I read a book or if I go to a training class, I want to make sure I come back and give a brown bag to my team and make sure that I transmit that information. That also feeds into improving capability. Improving quality. All feedback loops help to improve the quality of both quality of work life and quality of product. Increased capacity. Teams that are doing retrospectives, it's one of those sort of counterintuitive kinds of things that when they take time away from the work to do a retrospective, they actually end up getting more work done. So their capacity increases. And in general, because of these regular sort of timeouts to examine how is our teamwork going, how are our methods going, are our processes working for us, taking the time to do that builds trust and morale in the teams. So this is what we get when we do regular retrospectives. May not get it out of the first one or even out of the first two that you do, but when they become a regular part of how a project is accomplished, then we begin to see these kinds of benefits.
So we talked a little bit a few minutes ago on the Decide What to Do slide about actually getting results out of a retrospective. And one way to do that is to make sure that the plans are incorporated into the day-to-day work plan. So it's not some separate improvement plan over here or separate experiment plan over here. It's just we're going to do one thing in the next iteration or maybe two things in the next iteration to get better. So that's a key thing you can do. But then you have to support change. We find that when people are learning any new skill or going through any change, they need a few things to help them along. They need reinforcement. So they need to have that goal in front of them to know that this is why we're going through the pain of making a change. This is why we're going through the disruption of it. They need empathy. To understand, to acknowledge that change can be difficult and change can be hard. So it's not the, pull up your socks and buck up and get with the program. It's just, acknowledging that change can be difficult. People need opportunities to learn and try out the new things that they have decided they're going to incorporate into the way they're working. So they need opportunities to actually get the information, get the skills, and then practice. Because we all need to practice in order to learn anything new. I think most of us recognize that if we're learning a new sport, we aren't going to do it perfectly the first time. But somehow when we learn intellectual things or skill things, we often feel like, well, we went to class, we should know how to do it, But in reality, it takes practice. So to support people through change, we need to give them opportunities to practice. People need reminders because people will fall back into their old habits. So if your team has agreed that, on this iteration we are really going to become much more systematic about refactoring, people may need some reminders that, hey, we agreed that we were going to refactor, so we can't let that slide. So little reminders to help people build that new habit into their business as usual, kind of this is how we do things around here.
Yeah, one of the techniques that we hear about a lot in Agile teams are called big visible charts. And big visible charts can work very well as both reinforcers and reminders of what people have chosen to do in their next iterations.
And sharing responsibility. A trap that I see a lot on retrospectives is that the coach, the Agile coach or the manager or the project manager will say, oh, well, that's my problem to solve, and oh, I'll take care of that, and oh, that's on my list. And they suck up all the responsibility for making all the changes. And either they get overwhelmed and nothing gets done, or they set up a dynamic where the team doesn't believe anymore that they can actually act on their own behalf and make their own work life better. So I think it's really important in retrospectives to make sure that it's not just one person who takes responsibility for change. Sometimes it's, the most senior developer that will take all the responsibility, but I think it's really critical that that responsibility be shared. Okay, now what? Oh, people often ask us, what's the best retrospective you've ever been in? So what's the best retrospective you've ever been in, your favorite retrospective?
My favorite retrospective, well, I'm kind of a large group geek. I like working with very large groups, and so I had the opportunity one time to do a retrospective with 75 people in the room, and that was really fun. It was really fun, and it was looking at a really big project. It actually had been a 2.5-year project that had 300 people on it, so the 75 were sort of a representative sample of all the different functions and different areas that folks had, job areas that folks had done on the team. And they chose to really focus on how to replicate their success because they had created a really marvelous product that everybody thought was really cool by the time they got to the end. And so it was a very fun retrospective. It was one of my high points. What about you, Esther?
Well, I hate to choose just one.
I know. It's hard.
It's hard. And my favorite today, it might be a different one tomorrow, but my favorite one today is one where the developers had kind of known all along that this project wasn't going anywhere, but management was so intent on believing that it was going to work that they couldn't listen for whatever reason. And by the time we got to the retrospective, that group the developers were so angry that they were just spitting, and they were just bloated for bear and wanted to go after the managers. So I sent the managers off into another room to work on an activity, and I sat with the developers and talked to them about what their experience had been and how it felt to them. And they went from being very angry and very just saying some really, really nasty things about those managers that I cannot repeat in this room, to making just a very strong statement about, we are professionals. We will do our best to give you reliable information. We will tell you about our progress in these ways, and we expect in return that you'll listen to it. So they just made a really strong statement about, we are competent, capable, intelligent people. This is how we are going to contribute to the success. This is what we expect from you. And it was just a huge shift. And they went from being angry and beaten down to saying, we're not going to let this happen again. And we can talk about it in a way that's respectful of us and respectful of other people. So that's my favorite today.
So of those of you who have either led retrospectives or participated in one or more, who has a high point that you would like to share? We have a microphone in the middle of the room here. Who has a high point? This group could use some work. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have actually another high point that I really like was a
How come I
retrospective.
only got one?
Well, I'll give you another one
okay.
if you want. You could have several lows if you'd like. It's an anecdote that shows up in the book where during a retrospective we did a timeline, and in that one we gathered that sort of reaction data using sticky dots. We put sticky dots on the different events, and in that one I asked them to put one color of dot on if they thought this was something that happened that really helped the team during that period of time, and another color of dot if they thought it was something that really, was kind of a crisis or didn't work so well for the team. And there was this one card that had like all but one of the dots on it were, this was a great thing. And the one dot, was said, no, this was terrible. And so I just asked, well, tell what's going on here. And it turned out that one of the people on the team, a young woman on the team, had at one of the daily meetings had just blown up about something that she had been.
I'm going to go deal with the technology.
Okay. That she had been holding in for some time. And she thought that it really was disruptive to the team, that she had finally said this thing that had been she'd been holding in. And the rest of the team thought it was great. And watching the transformation of what happened in that team as they told her why that was so valuable to them, that she actually just said what she thought finally. And her hearing that what she had to say on the team was valued and was worthwhile was a pretty amazing moment.
And a perfect illustration of why it's important to gather data.
Yeah.
All right.
So
I think we're going to the next one now.
Next one, yeah.
Oh, low points.
In the desert of the low points.
In the desert, stranded in your wagon with nothing to pull it. Yeah. What's your low point, Diana? My low point is a time in a retrospective when it was very similar to what you were talking about earlier, when I was in a retrospective and this team had come up with way too many process improvements that they wanted to make, and one person on the team kept saying, I want to take care of that, I want to take care of that, I want to take care of that. And I kept asking, are you sure that this is the best way to do that? And there was no way I could budge them, nor could budge her, who was taking on all this stuff. And I kept saying, well, what are you going to take off your plate if you're putting all these things on? Nothing was. And so we walked out of there, and I had the feeling that things weren't going to go, the improvements were not going to happen. And sure enough, when I checked in about 6 weeks later with the person that had been my contact there, and I said, what's going on? And he said, well, this woman not much had happened because this woman had burnt out and left the company, and nobody had been, there wasn't any way for people to pick up all those things that she said she was going to do. So that felt pretty icky. Felt like they'd done a lot of work and they didn't get as much value for it as I would have liked to see them get. And they did actually made a couple of improvements out of it that were things other people said they would do, but the whole long list of things they didn't do. What about the one where the facilitator was the person leading the retrospective was?
Yeah, that was hard. That was when I was in.
Yeah.
I was in a retrospective.
that
Someone
was
else was leading it, and it was a brainstorming session. And as people called things out to be recorded, he was writing down what he wanted to write down instead of what people were saying. And that
It was kind
pretty
of
frustrating.
astonishing. I was
Yeah.
in the same retrospective. It was kind of astonishing.
Yeah.
And not very satisfying, and nothing happened.
Yeah.
Oh, surprise.
So I'd love to hear your low point
No,
stories.
I get to tell a low
I
point
know,
now.
but I just wanted, just before they get too excited about their low point stories.
Okay.
We want to hear yours too, but I'm noticing the time. So we'll hear Esther's, and then maybe we can hear your low point stories later on
And
today.
give you some ideas on how,
give you some ideas about how to
how
adjust.
you could address a situation like that.
So,
all right,
what's
so
your
my
low-
low point, I was in a big retrospective with, I think there were 30 people who had worked on this iteration. It was the end of a release, so it was like, 2 months worth of work. And one of the things I sometimes do in retrospectives is an activity called appreciations, where people just take a minute to say something that someone has done that really helped them. So people were doing that, that people think engineers won't like that, but my experience is they almost always do. So, it started a little slow, but then people started really liking it, and they were saying how I appreciated that you helped me find that bug, and I appreciated that you helped me learn how to use this particular. And the sponsor of the retrospective stood up and said, "The wrong people are being appreciated in this room," and stormed out. It's like one of those moments where you say, "Oh my goodness, whatever do I do now?" So I took a few deep breaths and I said, "What just happened?" And the people in the room said, "Oh, she's like that a lot." I thought, "Oh, well, this explains much about this organization." So again, I gave them a task to do, and they said, "She'll be in the ladies' room sulking." So I had to go off to the ladies' room and have a chat. And I don't know what I would have done if it had been the men's room, but I might have gone in and had a chat. I might have, just put a sign up on the door, "Out of order, don't come in," and gone in and had the chat. But so we had a chat, and then it surfaced a bunch of other stuff that was going on with the management team there, which we then worked on, and things got a little better. But hey, I lived, and chances are that sooner or later, if you do retrospectives, you'll run into something that's a little distressing and not quite what you anticipated, but you'll live through it. You live through it.
Yeah. You get over it.
Yeah, and you
then
get to tell stories.
Yeah, then you have great stories to tell.
Yeah.
So, so this has been a pretty fast and high-level overview of what we think of as really important things to think about when you're thinking about having working in Agile practices. I mean, I blogged on this a little while back. I have a feeling that if any team that was really focused on continually improving their methods and their teamwork, and that was in an atmosphere, a company that supported learning, and they did regular retrospectives, I think sooner or later they'd sort of invent most of the Agile practices on their own. But that's just me. So I think it's very central to, as Esther said earlier, it's a part of the inspect and adapt cycle. You really can't be Agile, doing Agile methods, using these philosophies and practices, if you're not inspecting and adapting all of it. And the retrospective is the best tool I know for inspecting and adapting methods and teamwork and processes. So I just want to leave you with a thought about what one thing, if you could just change one thing about your retrospectives so that you think you would just get a little more value out of them, what would that one thing be? What would that one thing be? What
Maybe
one
it's
thing
have
would you
one.
change? Don't try to do a wholesale thing.
Yeah.
Just one thought.
Start doing it.
Start doing them is a good one. Thank you, Dave. Yeah. But there might be others. For those of you who are already doing them, there might be something that you want to, little increment you want to tweak. So we want to leave you with that thought. And thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you
Delighted
so
to
much.
have all of you show up with us.
And we will be at the
We're going to be at.
what are we going to be at?
It's Room Turner over there from 4 to 5 in 1 hour.
So if you have other questions or want, generate some ideas about how you can work with your retrospectives, we'd be happy to talk to you.
Are there other people you want to send?
Yeah.
Thank you.